one of the foremost experts on trade, both kind of the mechanics of trade, how it works, but also how to undertake trade in a way that it actually helps people, helps build local economies and strengthen national economies. Lori Wallach is somebody I've been following for a good while now. She has a 30 plus years of working in trade, both as an analyst, somebody who really dives deeply into trade, what's good, what works, and what does not, and has been very much in the throes of the policy debate because she's worked as on congressional trade issues going all the way back to NAFTA, the infamous NAFTA. Currently, Lori is the director of Rethink Trade, which is a terrific name for an organization because it's something that we've needed to do for a long time. And it's also something that Democrats and liberals need to do because we kind of have pretty stilted view of trade, including the Democrats' general liberal and Democrat response to the Trump tariffs as just almost an embrace of free trade, as if tariffs were a dirty word and you should never do tariffs. And Lori is going to talk to us tonight about tariffs, how to do them right, how they're being done wrong, and how we can get a little better understanding. So we're really thrilled and honored to be joined by Lori Wallach for tonight's briefing, or this afternoon's briefing, excuse me. I'm speaking from Sicily, so I have a slightly different view of the time we're in. Lori, take it away.
Well, wow. Thank you for joining from Sicily, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor. Hello to everybody. I am not joining from any place amazing. I'm here in Washington, D.C., in the belly of the beast. And I put together some slides, which are more slides than we'll have time to go through, but I want them to be shareable so you can go back and dig in a little bit more because the stuff is a little wonky. And one of the things a lot of my slides have are links, live links that we don't have time to share together, but there are things that you can go back and dig in more if you want to understand more of the issues I'm going to cover. So I included some just background information because I know different people are entering this conversation at different places. Just the most basic thing, tariff is a fee that is collected on a good when it is sent from one country across the border into another. Tariffs are only on goods. Tariffs are not on services or investments. Those are taxes. So a tariff is on a good. And the money goes when a good is charged a tariff, the money goes into the US Treasury. It's collected by Customs, which is now part of, Border Patrol, Customs and Border Patrol. The firms who are the importers pay for the tariff. So if you're going to import something that has a tariff, the company that chooses to import versus buying it from, wholesaling it from a country that doesn't have a tariff or getting it domestically, they pay. Very important thing to know is tariffs do not necessarily raise consumer prices. We're going to go into why that is. Consumer prices are one set of pricing. Wholesale pricing is a different set of pricing. The tariff is charged on the wholesale price. So for like the $120 pair of the tennis shoes, you pay $120 for the Nikes. Those come into the US at less than $20 wholesale. So even if you have a 25% tariff, or let's make it easier, you have a 20% tariff and you add the $5, you now have a shoe that, is still under $30 and the markup is to 120. So typically with a lot of times the wholesale price having a big gap to the retail price, the retailer just eats that. And that's largely what happened with the tariffs when Trump was president the first time. Most of that studies show most of the tariffs were eaten actually by the retailers. So countries set tariff levels. There's a thing called, you'll sometimes hear people talk about an MFN, most favored nation. That is your bound tariff level. You bind it at the WTO or before that at the GATT. And that applies to most of the other countries. And it applies to all the other countries who are in a trade agreement with you, unless you have a free trade agreement, at which point it's zero tariffs between those countries largely. MFN rates are not reciprocal. So like we set a rate, so for automobiles, 2.5%, everyone who sells automobiles in the US before Trump's tariffs was paying 2.5%. But for instance, the MFN rate in Europe is 10%. So any car you send to Europe gets a 10% tariff. But every country that sends cars to us, 2.5, every country that sends cars to Europe, 10%. So they're not reciprocal between countries. And this is something that Trump is a little obsessed about, as I'm going to point out. That is not the crux of the problem. Those numbers are not the crux of the problem. Generally, tariffs have been at historic lows. The way you measure them is you do a trade weighted average. So what you actually, if you're not importing something, the fact that it has 1,000% tariff doesn't matter. What you want to know is what is the actual average tariff, the stuff you import. And based on that, the MFN, the trade weighted bound tariffs, the US was just above 2%. Europe was a little bit higher at 2.7, Japan a little bit lower. The rates generally, even of countries like China, who you think of as not really having much trade access, was 3%. Now, even though some countries have peaks, which are particularly higher tariffs, the kind of things that actually lead to big trade imbalances are things like currency manipulation, subsidies, and other mercantilist policies we're going to get into. A thing to know for the US is the US Constitution grants exclusive authority over tariffs to Congress. So all the times a president uses a tariff, it's a delegated authority. And there are a bunch of big fights about that, which we're going to get into. The Congress has delegated a bunch of authorities, and they're useful things that a president can do with a tariff. So how about President Trump's tariff? So we're going to look at 4 particular things. What's the problem he's trying to fix? What's actually the policy now, given it's been on, off, sideways? Will what Trump is doing fix this problem, or is there a better way to try and do it? And then what can any of us do? And, preview of coming attractions. One of the things that we can do is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the revised NAFTA, is coming up for a mandatory 6-year review. And that's one that Congress is going to be involved in. And that could set some rules about what good trade agreements are while the tariff fight is sort of rolling around on the side. By the way, I put in a bunch of funny cartoons because this is a stressful issue. And on some level, after 30 plus years of working on trade, we have to make fun of the existential mess that we are in. So the cartoons are not to make it seem like it's not serious, but more for like relief. One of the key things, I put in 3 slides just for sort of Trade 101 to situate people. There are sort of a couple of key things to know, and one of them is today's trade policies aren't mainly about trade, qua trade, and not free trade. So I jokingly think that the philosophers of free trade like Adam Smith and David Ricardo are probably rolling in their graves, because you have so-called trade agreements like the World Trade Organization or the NAFTA, which then became the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Most of the chapters have nothing to do with tariffs, which is what we're going to mainly talk about. Instead, they impose rules, a lot of them protectionism, really, like extended patent protections, big pharma wanted, extra monopolies countries have to guarantee and give to one industry to not compete, or rules banning limits on the size. So competition policy stuff, antitrust stuff, are rules that are in these trade agreements. These are all neoliberal, sort of corporate rigged rules. And in part, that's because, another second thing to know about our trade agreements, the US has had an outsized role in writing these rules. And we have had historically 500 official trade advisors who get to see all the secret texts. And of those, about 85% represent direct corporate interests, trade associations, companies. Interestingly, in the agricultural sector, the agriculture sector is way overrepresented relative to its share of the percentage of our economy, but it's almost all agribusiness. So all the other parts of rural economies are largely left out. And you have, the Caterpillars and the implement makers, the insurance companies, the seed companies having lots of seats, as well as the Cargill is on 3 or 4 different committees, Archer Daniels and a bunch of different committees. The thing to understand is these rules, basically, every country has to conform their domestic policies to these rules. So the guy who was the first head of the WTO basically was very, off message and admitted, we are writing the Constitution for a single global economy. What does that mean for democracy? So here is the WTO, here is the pre-WTO situation, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, but Bretton Woods, 1944, the big conference that created the modern global trade system. The GATT, General Agreement, Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Those are the three institutions that came out ostensibly to manage the global economy. The big red box there with the X through it is the International Trade Organization. That is, to some degree, our back to the future solution, because the ITO, which the US Senate sacked, which was sort of Keynes' version of how to do trade as compared to the US, which was all about free trade, cut tariffs. The people representing FDR were Democrats, who in those days meant Southerners, and there were a bunch of Tennessee commodity traders were our negotiators. They had a different view, and the US Senate wasn't going to have any of these good stuff that Keynes and others wanted in what should have been a more just trade system that had labor standards, that had competition policy rules, that had rules against currency cheating, etc. That got sacked. And instead, we got the World Trade Organization. And all those other agreements are the things I was mentioning about that have nothing to do with trade. General Agreement in Trade and Services, you can't regulate services. You can't decide how many entities a particular company can have, how many services. You can't limit the size or the ownership form. Sanitary and phytosanitary rules limits food safety standards. Technical barriers to trade, the name says it all. That is for any regulatory standard that is not about food. So like even some food rules, the country of origin labels that disappeared that used to have for meat in the US for like 10 years. The WTO rule, those are illegal under that agreement. TRIPS, those are the monopoly extensions, etc. So that's the system. Just the key thing here down the bottom, each member shall ensure the conformity of its laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with its obligations as provided in the agreement. So you have to make all your domestic laws meet those rules. So we now have 30 years of that kind of a system, and the NAFTA had all of that and worse. And what we ended up with in the world is in the US is a huge hunkin' trade deficit. And it's been chronic since 1975. It's hit $1 trillion. It means, a trade deficit means we import a lot more stuff than we export. And it's not just that we're not making that stuff anymore, which we're not, but it's also everyone whose stuff we're buying, then they have a lot of hot dollars that they have to reinvest. So a big part of how our country has gotten so financialized, how, for instance, real estate's gotten so bid up and how the stock market's gone crazy, is all of those things that we're buying that other people make, the money has to come back here and look for investment return. And so part of the disaster of our trade deficit relates also to the financialization, where our major export has become basically dollar-denominated assets. Now, the trade part of this imbalance means that just since we had China enter the WTO with the US congressional vote, since we've had the NAFTA, we've lost 90,000 factories and about 6 million manufacturing jobs in a very short period of time. This is not like slowly transitioning to a different kind of economy. This is a relatively wipeout. Factory towns took it the hardest. These are the communities, are not big cities, they're not small towns. They are all across rural America. They are middle-sized towns that used to be sort of the local place you would go off farm for a factory job. It's where you would go to a specialist doctor if you live in a small town. Medium-sized towns, not really part of it, not like suburban to a big metropolis. And they had the heart and soul of manufacturing. And it's basically where the American middle class and the union movement was born all across the country. And we have lost so many millions of jobs in these factory towns that we have seen actually depopulation, but also this is where the deaths of despair that we read about are really concentrated. Our US general projected life expectancy has started to decline since 2021. And that was not COVID. And that was not a particular problem of old people dying sooner. That was working age people, particularly in certain zip codes that had been severely deindustrialized, and they're dying of, what Professor Deaton calls deaths of despair. So alcoholism, overdoses, suicide. It's a very serious and horrifying situation where we basically have shrunk our capacity to be self-reliant, but we've also taken away good jobs out of the economy altogether for the 66% of Americans who don't have college degrees. 2/3 of Americans, is now 63%, do not have college degrees. There are people who could be making a good job making things, and it doesn't exist. And it's not just manufacturing. We have a growing food trade deficit now. You think of America as, the big food producer. We are producing commodities, which we export, corn, soy, wheat, but a lot of the food we eat is now imported. Ag trade report, and it was hidden. The report that goes with it was hidden because it was going to show an even bigger projected deficit for this year. We, are basically importing large amounts of the fruits, vegetables, almost all the seafood that we consume, a not small amount of meat and poultry. Now, as though some of it's raised, pastured here, it's shipped to Mexico for processing in plants that don't meet the same standards and where workers don't have to be paid a decent wage. We have a huge trade deficit vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but there are other countries that have big deficits. We have a very large trade deficit. Our largest component of it's with China. And when President Trump put tariffs on China in the first term, we had what's called trade displacement. So you can see the trade deficits with those bars got much bigger with other countries, particularly in Asia. Vietnam, we had $150 billion more trade deficit, and Mexico, the deficit exploded. And basically it made up the difference. It was like squeezing a balloon. So for the same amount of less deficit from China, with those tariffs just hitting China, then we just had the production go elsewhere. A lot of them are actually Chinese plants in Mexico or in Vietnam. They just changed the locations. So our unbalance in trade right now is global. We are the biggest deficit country. China is the biggest surplus country, but there are problems worldwide at this point. And this chart is very compelling in that you've got literally 15 to 18 countries, I'll show them in a second, that have huge trade surpluses. And Germany is the second largest after China. You've got 66 countries in the world now, besides the US, including a lot of the big developing countries, Mexico, India, who have trade deficits. So they actually now also have tariffs up against China, and then the rest are in balance. And this systematic imbalance, where you can see chronic deficit countries, you'll see a lot of countries that you would not, expect them to be in that list. You have by the way, the ones that are in bold are countries that the US has trade agreements with. And the ones in red are the big deficit countries. That's not just a natural resource. Those other, big surplus countries. We have deficits with them. They have big surpluses. The ones in red are manufacturing surpluses versus some of the other countries, it's oil, gas, and natural resource. So you see there are a bunch of European countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. China is by far the biggest. Those are the countries that basically are leading to the imbalance with everyone else, with China being a huge share of it. And a bunch of those countries practice what are called mercantilist policies. You sometimes have heard them called beggar thy neighbor. Those are policies that intentionally are aimed at boosting your manufacturing and your exports, basically to the damage of your neighbors. And so widespread industrial subsidies, not like the targeted ones Biden did for EVs or solar, but in China, you get the land free for the factory. They build the factory for you. The electricity and the water to run the factory are provided by the government. The transport to markets from the government, the shippings from the government. You can't possibly compete with that kind of top to bottom subsidy. As well, wage suppression. So in Vietnam and China, the government sets the wage. You just can't. Doesn't matter. There are no independent unions. In Mexico, There's been a comprehensive system of basically having not independent unions, having company unions to keep the wages down. If you can imagine right now, Mexico's wages in real terms are lower than China's. So the other thing that we have that's a very serious problem is currency manipulation. You basically bring down the value of your currency because the dollar is the exchange currency for global trade. And so if you basically have your currency devalued, you end up making it much cheaper when it converts, and the dollar becomes too expensive for people in your country to buy. The issue that we now have is with this imbalance, trade's not working for anyone. So we really need to fix the trade imbalance as part of how we go forward, and tariffs are part of that, but they're not the only solution or even like the main solution the way Trump thinks it is. And so we're now going to shift a little bit into what the hell he did. His idea was to try and have more balance, but that is not actually the way he's doing it. It's not going to get that result. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wrote them down because it's so dang confusing. And so I want to unpack it for everyone. The ones in bold are the ones you really have to pay attention to. And on the next slide, which I'm also, no quizzes on this, no one else has to memorize it. But the ones, this unpacks, the ones in bold, I then explain what percentage, et cetera, so that you don't have to have a nervous breakdown trying to figure out what is the tariff these days. These two slides basically go through it, but I also listed all the other ones that are sort of preview of coming attraction. So like all of those ones in March are investigations under a law called Section 232. Those are going to be tariffs in the future. But for right now, the stuff that's in bold, those are the tariffs that are in effect. And the best real-time chart, I think, is the one I have there with the link on the bottom that gets updated like within a day. So that's a good way to also track if you want to get down into the longitude. They do an even finer level of detail than I do. But basically, where we were was there were tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada about fentanyl that were put in place under a thing called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, it's called in short. It's a law that gives a president broad discretion to do things like economic sanctions. So like it's what Biden used to cut off Russia when they invaded the Ukraine. And it's used a lot by a lot of presidents, but it's not typically used for tariffs. So this was a novel thing that Trump did. The only countries in the world where there is still duty-free entry is our USMCA, our NAFTA partners, Mexico and Canada. For things that comply with the NAFTA replacement agreement, those are still duty-free. So that is part of the reason why making the rules negotiations about USMCA makes sense, because that's one of your few low tariff entryways in. Section 232 refers to another trade authority. Again, like I said, it's all constitutional as to Congress, so it's all delegated. Section 232 is national security. So the steel and aluminum national security finding has been around for 10 years, and that's something Biden also used. The new one, though, is auto parts. Biden did that one. He never actually got to put the tariffs in place. Trump put the tariffs in place in March. Those are now for steel and aluminum as of this very morning at midnight are 50%, and for 25% for autos and auto parts, except if the content is American, then it doesn't apply to that. Then the trade Lollapalooza. On April 2nd, Trump put into place what he called the Liberation Day tariffs, and he used that International Economic Emergencies Authority to do that. So it's 10% on almost every country in the world. It's basically 10% in any country we had most favored trade status with. So like the Russias, the North Koreas, they already have higher other tariffs. But everyone else got 10%, and then 67 countries got more than 10%. And there's a bunch of stuff that's carved out. And so it's called an exemption list, Annex 2. Everything that's going to be subject to Section 232 national security tariffs, or that already is, was carved out. And then everything else was in. And then down the road, in a totally corrupt deal, they added a bunch of exclusions for Apple, cell phones, computer monitors, gross. And Trump actually, as he is wont to do, said out loud, I did a good thing for Tim Cook. And then the next day they published this list. Blah. So far, there have not been other exclusions, and there is no exclusion process. So the first time around, there were a lot of exclusions. Then in April, only a week after all those tariffs went into place, there was a 90-day pause on the tariffs that are higher, the 67 countries higher tariffs. Some of those tariffs are up to 55%. That runs out on July 9th, and it goes back into effect. Then, theoretically, they may continue it. Then the US and China were doing escalating back and forth tit for tat retaliation, and it got to a place where the US was charging 145% on goods from China, which meant they weren't coming in. And they were charging 125% everything from the US. They made a deal in the middle of May, and they went to 20% tariffs for those fentanyl tariffs, plus 10% on both sides. So that means 30% on Chinese goods, 10% in our stuff. And ostensibly, they're going to have a negotiation, which seems to have hit the rocks, and we could very soon have escalating tariffs on China again. All right, now, none of this is certain, in part because then on May 28th, the Court of International Trade invalidated all of the IEEPA tariffs, the fentanyl ones, the regular ones. But then the next day, the appeals court in DC put a stay. And the stay is still being litigated as to whether it's going to be permanent. But if I would guess, I think the tariffs are going to stay in place through the decision on the merits of the challenge of the emergency authority and whether any of that's legitimate. The Court of International Trade said, no, you can't do general broad tariffs using that authority, find a different authority. I suspect we'll get a stay and it'll go to the Supreme Court, maybe still before they adjourn in the beginning of July. Otherwise, we have until October 6th, where it will all stay in place. So, whoops. That's strange. I think there's a slide missing there, but I will just move on. So what the actual sort of results of all of this and how it's working, I think is, sort of epitomized by us doing tariffs on countries with which we have trade surpluses. So, basically what the tariff is, the way a lot of people are looking at the way these tariffs are implemented, because they don't make sense. Don't put tariffs on countries with which you have trade surpluses. We have a trade surplus with Canada. What the hell do we put tariffs on Canada for? Or what the tariff, don't put tariffs on everything at the same time. So basically, if you want to rebuild manufacturing, which was ostensibly the goal here, you don't go from a country that's totally addicted to imports to cold turkey, because your supply chain of your own manufacturing uses imported parts. So if you want to keep your own factories going, you don't just one day hit everything. You hit, for instance, finished products, but not parts and inputs, or not machinery for manufacturing. You don't make it harder to set up new factories or to keep your current factories going. And you don't do it all at once at a high level. So the first time around, the tariffs were phased in. They started at a lower level, and everyone had, a year to know, get your act together, find a different supply chain, because they're going up in another year. But instead here, they just went from 0 to 100 miles an hour on every country all the time. And as a result, you have existing factory construction projects that started under Biden that are now on hold because they can't get the parts, they can't get the equipment. And then, finally, do it consistently. Do not turn tariffs on and turn tariffs off. Because if you're trying to send a signal to the market, then what you're saying is, hey, if you make it over there, it's going to have a tariff. But invest here, build a factory. We have a huge consumer market. Make your stuff here and export it to someone else. Make it here. But if you have the tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs on, tariffs off, no investor is going to make a risk of some billion-dollar factory that will take 10 years to get your money back and 20 years to make a profit. So, in fact, the supply chain won't move unless you have consistent tariffs. Once the tariffs went into place, the administration, after they put the 90-day freeze on, changed their tune from everyone's just going to have to pay a price to sell stuff here to, oh, it was always our plan to make deals and try and get bilaterally. Well, let's make reciprocal tariff levels. Well, that's not going to fix anything. Let's sell more US stuff. Well, that's not going to fix anything. And what they ended up basically doing was making really corrupt deals to get, for instance, Starlink, Musk's company got new permissions in different countries very quickly for countries that wanted tariff relief. And the Trump resorts and his sons are running around like making deals for new approvals from Vietnam, just approved a building, a huge resort tower, blah, blah, that they were not going to approve because they're in the middle of tariff negotiations. They're also using the tariff leverage, squandering it to threaten countries to get rid of, for instance, the really important oversight of big tech companies. So they're threatening Europe. If you don't get rid of the Digital Millennium Act or the Digital Services Act or the AI Act, we're going to keep your tariffs and make them even higher. And then also it's trying to force countries to buy things they don't want. So like countries are trying to go on to non-carbon energies, making them buy LNG. And I know that this picture is disgusting because it's poop behind each door, but frankly, the way that they're negotiating this, it seems like the perfect cartoon for the situation. And then finally, when you do tariffs, get them right, do it professionally. That chart that you saw listed countries that don't exist. It listed entities that do not have separate customs unions. No, the penguins are not being tariffed. The Heard and McDonald Islands are part of the customs territory of Australia. Do not fear for the penguins. But it does show that it was done in a totally half-assed way. And then they missed a bunch of countries that actually do have, the US has trade deficit with a couple countries that they missed and didn't have on their damn charts. So it's a little bit haphazard. It's very haphazard. It wasn't well planned, and it didn't have to be that way. But that is how Trump himself, according to every story I've heard, insisted on doing it as compared to using the proper authorities and doing a more targeted and strategic approach. So sort of unpacking now what is the impact. Rural America is just having like a tariff tornado come rip through it because of the inconsistent on again, off again. Some of the plants that were being opened in rural areas that were going to be new plants for solar and for EVs and et cetera are on hold because they can't get the equipment. Even the chip plants, now suddenly it's much more expensive to import the equipment with these new tariffs. So it's chilling existing plans. The stock market roller coaster has made everyone's savings or their school funds a wreck. And then, for every small business that's become reliant on imports, retail businesses, but also small manufacturers, doing this all at once, all the countries at a high level means you don't have alternative sources. Like normally when you target the worst players, you can go to countries that have trade balance and you can get the imports from them at a more reasonable price if there isn't a domestic alternative. But if you do it all the countries all the time really high, it's a disaster. We don't know the full effect though, because we've got this 90-day pause through July 9th. The stuff coming in from China was paused. So we know that the port traffic went down, but then they reopened the trade when the tariffs went down. We do know tariffs prices are not spiking, but there's a bunch of price gouging being threatened. And so you can sort of see that where you have, for instance, you have companies like Home Depot saying, yeah, some things are a little bit more expensive, but we have a margin. We'll absorb it. We're not going to raise prices. Versus you had Amazon and Walmart saying, we're going to have to raise prices. And that's them basically volitionally raising prices. And there's a lot of a price gouging element to that. Another impact is political. Because of the incredible misuse of tariffs by Trump, the polling has shifted from a situation where during last year's election, tariffs in general and his tariffs on China that he was advocating 60% were remarkably, remarkably favorable. And there's been an incredible swing that at this point, pretty much everyone, certainly all the Democrats, a lot of independents, but almost a plurality of Republicans now are concerned about the tariffs. And that's not great because, as John said, there are good uses of tariffs. There are reasons you want to use tariffs, which I'm going to explain. And so Trump is kind of poisoning a really important policy tool that is important to a variety of goals we have of rebuilding a little bit more resilience in our country, being able to make some of the things as a continental-sized country we really should be able to make some of, like some of our own medicine, which we make almost none of, etc. And the other thing that's happening is a real polarization between the parties. where the Republicans, including a bunch of totally rabid free traders, are running around saying, the dear leader had this all planned. This is all according to plan. Everything's peachy, which of course is total baloney. But the Democrats are having this, neoliberal knee-jerk reaction where their anti-Trump reaction is turning into pro-bad trade agreement, bad trade policy. And if you think about it, it was the Democrats who fought against NAFTA. It was the Democrats who stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was the Democrats who fought against China going into the WTO. The Republicans were all for it. And now you've got the Democrats having such a reaction against Trump that they're sounding like, they're basically a throwback to the old NAFTA days. So as a result, you've got all of the fans of the old trade agenda repackaging it and pushing for that same old thing, basically using the tariffs as a way to try and pick up the old agenda. So there are good uses of tariffs. I'm going to wrap up and then open for Q&A. One thing you can use tariffs for is in a suite of industrial policy tools, tariffs preserve market space so that you actually have the ability to target things you really want to build up. Every country that has a strong industrial base has some of this. And so you use a whole set of tools. You use tax credits to create consumer demand and procurement policies to create demand. So if, for instance, the administration, we're not just going to tariff medicines because they're about to, but we're going to try and rebuild some US capacity to make some essential medicines, the first thing you would do is you pass laws that gave requirements for all of the military procurement through TRICARE, Medicare, and Medicaid to start procuring, get a benefit in procuring American-made meds. And you would phase that in. You wouldn't make it mandatory right away, but you give a preference. So you're creating demand. You would create tax benefits for the U.S. pharmaceutical industry, but also for new entrants at an even higher rate to build new capacity in the U.S. You give tax credits to retailers to source American-made medicines. You create demand, you create supply, you create capacity. And then once you had that going, in like year 2, you would start slowly phasing in tariffs, particularly targeting the things you now know you had some capacity to make, but you wouldn't hit the whole world. You'd leave some duty-free or low tariff entrants for countries. For instance, you might decide, we're never going to make a lot of antibiotics. We'll continue to rely on the EU for a lot of that. So you wouldn't tariff them for antibiotics. But if you're going to do analgesics in the US or whatever you're going to do, then you would have a tariff on the thing you're focusing on. Part of the trade rebalancing is going to have to be also dealing with the countries that are in the losing angle with us, the other countries are suffering deficits, and the balanced countries, and working together to get the surplus countries to clean up their act. And that's, of course, the opposite of what Trump is doing. He's poking equally at countries that should be our partners in trying to rebalance and countries that are the problem causing the rebalance. But there is a way to do that, and you can use tariffs together in a common market kind of format where you would have different rules for the countries that are willing to have balanced trade, that are willing to meet labor standards, environmental standards. And you basically create a lucrative demand to clean up the act of the countries that would want to be in that but would be left out because of their imbalance. We did see industrial policy using tariffs, which the tariff, again, keeps out the unfairly traded stuff. So the tariff's role is to have the stuff that is trade cheating not come and flood your market. So if you're doing the other parts of industrial policy, your infant industries aren't flattened by unfair imports. And so that is exactly what Biden did, building on raising the level of the Trump tariffs on China. And he did it for EVs, he did it for solar, and he basically got the highest rate of investment in new US factory manufacturing in 30 years. 2023 was the highest rate in 30 years. But that was a combination of sequencing the things like the infrastructure bill and the IRA and all of the different industrial policy incentives, along with the tariffs, which are just part of the whole package. Similarly, you got to figure out who is going to pay for what is going to have to be a cost of transition from imbalance and not manufacturing to manufacturing. And obviously, it's got to be the companies that made all the money offshoring to low-wage places who should pay, not the workers and consumers who've already paid. So that means we need, as well as the industrial policies, strong competition enforcement. So, that right now the Federal Trade Commission has price surveillance powers they're not using to make sure there's not price gouging. There's some new price gouging trade bills coming down the pike. We need to make sure that there is easier to join a union so that the protection turns into higher wages and benefits workers and not just meaning more profits for the owners of the company. And so we need the unions to be able to fight for the workers' share of the trade protection gains. Similarly, we need to ban stock buybacks for the companies that are enjoying the protection. So again, the money goes to the workers. And we also need to have the industrial policies stay in place. The Republicans are trying to kill the CHIPS bill, the IRA, and enact new programs for the sectors that we have as national security necessities under Section 232. But mainly, in the biggest picture, we need to work with other partner countries and replace the trade system with a system that has a floor of decency, competition policy, etc. So actions and decision points. Congress has been on the warpath trying to get themselves back into the tariff game. We're going to see what's happened. These lawsuits are part of how that's going to play out. There are many of these tariff relief negotiations. Some of them might turn into full-fledged trade agreements. Then Congress will have a role. There are at least 4 of them that look like they're going to be that, with India, the EU, UK, and Korea. And then there's the mandatory USMCA review, which the negotiations of which will start soon. If any of these trade agreements turn into actual congressional fights, then there'll be floor vote fights, and we can all have a role in that. The NAFTA renegotiation, the USMCA renegotiation is happening. I want to flag Citizens Trade Campaign is the coalition that was created during NAFTA 30 years ago. They have staff across the country. If you go to citizenstrade.org, you can get on the map and find out who the contact is in your state if you want to hook up with a state level coalition who's working on these kinds of issues. And that is the overview. And I'm going to figure out how to turn off the sharing, and then we can talk and have Q&A. And hopefully that was a good basic overview. So now everyone feels a little bit more comfortable having a conversation about the issues.
Lori, thanks so much. That was a very dense and at the same time very understandable overview, and I appreciate both the background and the focus on kind of the current situation with Trump's tariffs. If I'm going to start the questions, I know there's several in the chat. I'm going to ask Erica to lift those up. Just reminder to folks, if you want to ask a question verbally, please do a hand raise, the symbol. And if I don't see you, maybe Erica will call on you. But in any event, we're about to get to questions. My question to you, Lori, is given the complexity of trade, given how trade, so-called free trade, has become kind of a boogeyman for a lot of folks, particularly the working class, and rightly so, what would you advise people who don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of all tariffs, but also want actual policy that would work? How would you, as simply as possible, advise us to frame the issue as people who are opposing Trump, but agree that some level of tariffs are appropriate?
So a couple of ground rules from the focus groups and the polling I've seen. One thing is to make sure to make clear what you're talking about is Trump's tariffs or Trump's chaotic tariffs, because you don't want to basically, as you said, throw out the baby with the bathwater and make it seem like you're against all tariffs. So Trump's tariffs are so chaotic and unstrategic, they're not getting the results we need. But boy, we really need a new trade system that balances trade and creates opportunities for our farmers, for our very hardworking manufacturing workers. We need to make more things here to make sure we're resilient, and we can help make the whole world have more balanced and fair trade. That's a way to basically, you take down Trump's particular tariffs, but you make clear like the status quo sucks. And so I have a union hall version of that is basically the other way around, which is, all right, we can all agree our current trade system is totally screwed up and has been like a disaster for working people, for rural economies, for most of our towns. So is Trump making it better? No, because he's basically trying to fix a trade catastrophe, doing surgery with a saxophone, not a scalpel. Wrong tools, wrong targets. But can we use tariffs usefully? Absolutely. And should we? Sure. As well as a whole bunch of other policies, because we can make things here again, and we will. So that's more that version.
That's excellent. That's great. I think I know everybody's looking for the recording, and among the many things they've learned, I think that very quick synopsis of how to frame it is terrific. Erica, you want to bring up a couple of questions from the chat?
Um, yeah, what's the connection between tariff policy and immigration? So like if the impact of our tariffs is increasing or decreasing prosperity in a country that we tend to get a lot of immigration from, what's the connection there?
It's a super complicated question because I've been doing a lot of conversations with my longtime allies and partners from the WTO fights of the last 30 years. And interestingly, the reaction in certain parts of the world is more or less, you know something? We've been over-reliant using the US as like the main and only market for our exports. We should have actually been trading more amongst ourselves. How more regional trade so that, you know, there could be a transition period where countries are hurting because they've lost their US export markets. But if they actually end up being more integrated amongst themselves and having a more balanced dynamic amongst themselves, that in the end could actually be a good thing. Because the one thing I'm telling a lot of them is whether it's Trump and his unilateral, you know, ham-handed disaster, or it is a more thoughtful approach in the future, we're not going to be able to sustain trillion, multi-trillion dollar deficits year in and year out. Because, you know, it is a prediction of economic theory that when you have a chronic large trade deficit, you deindustrialize your country and you increase income inequality. Like, this is not rocket science. This is what happens when you've been doing what we've been doing for all these years. And when you get to a certain percentage of GDP, your trade deficit gets to a certain percentage of GDP. You're even if you've got the reserve currency, you're asking yourself for all kinds of, you know, not just the social crises we already have, but actually economic crises. So one way or the other, we are not going to be the sink of everyone else's exports. And so I wouldn't want to do it in this shock kind of adjustment of like one day it's normal and the next day it's, but it's not a bad thing that the US market may be, the signal may be, don't rely on the US market. Now, in the short term, yes, it's going to cause a lot of different unknown shocks in supply chains, in countries' economies, because so much of the world has been organized under this unfair system where you have the handful of mercantilist countries who are pumping out exports everywhere. You have literally Brazil, South Africa with tariffs up against China at this point because they're getting deindustrialized by this mercantilist behavior and they've become deficit countries. So the whole system is so out of kilter. It's not like if you'd asked me that question 30 years ago, I could have told you a better prediction. But at this point, it's gotten so out of whack, it's a little bit hard to know. And a related thing that, you know, I don't think the Trumpsters have thought about is if we are deporting a bunch of people who are in US production jobs because they don't have their papers, and we're trying at the same time to reindustrialize domestically, are we losing a lot of existing skilled industrial workers? Now, yes, we want to bring in a new generation that requires training, vocational training, et cetera, but it is not necessarily a separate discussion, but that's the way it's playing out.
Before Eric asks the next question, what you said about those other countries saying maybe we should trade more amongst ourselves, maybe we shouldn't be so dependent on the US, that's pretty closely analogous to the argument that Michael Schuman and Stacy Mitchell and myself and others who are local economy advocates have been saying for a long time. Wouldn't it be better if the stuff we bring in was that we didn't become so utterly dependent on that? If we generated more regional self-reliance, then sure, we have wealth, we can bring things in that we can't make here, but seems pretty similar to that.
Exactly right. I mean, if I had a magic wand in my system to replace the WTO with the floor of decency of labor and environmental standards, and by the way, not US standards, but the International Labor Organization, the rules of the multilateral environmental agreements, these are rules and standards to which countries as a sovereign has already assigned, but they're not right now enforced. And in fact, the trade rules trump them if there's a conflict. So you have to get rid of your ban on forced labor or whatever. If it was that system, I think that one of the phenomenon we would see that'd be much more balanced is everyone would have more regional integration. And for the US, we'd be making more stuff in a continental sized country of stuff we really also just need some resilience source of, but we would also diversify our imports. Because even if it was our best neighbor, Canada, and we were 100% reliant on them for name your medical supply, that's a bad thing. In the same way, you don't want one plant only making sterile saline bags so that when you have the hurricane we did in North Carolina gets knocked out, we have like a crisis in every hospital. We need more resilience, which is more redundancy, which is more diversity and more local capacity. And then you go out of the local system when you need to, which is why trade still has a lot of value, but you have it ordered in a system also, frankly, that's more environmentally sustainable. Because the idea right now of schlepping all this stuff long distance just is mind-boggling. Just as like a recovering trade attorney, I must share the statistic that I find the most horrifying, which is the United States is one of the largest exporters of soy, and we are one of the largest importers. And no one wins by this except Cargill and ADM, who are like shorting farmers on both sides. But if you think about what is more or less water with like cellulose and some protein around it being schlepped across numerous oceans in ships spewing carbon, it is mind-blowing. But the current rules actually make that profitable for the trading companies, and the farmers get stiffed on both ends. That's the kind of stuff you would fix if you change the trade rules.
Yeah, so a related question to what you were just talking about in terms of, trying to rebuild our resiliency with certain types of manufacturing. Someone was asking, well, which kinds are the most important? Which types of manufacturing, which industries, both in terms of resilience and also this questioner Edward question, like the multiplier effect for local growth. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you probably do.
So interestingly, there is some agreement with some outlying issues across partisan lines, because the issues that the Biden administration did those 100-day emergency supply chain reviews right when they came in after, looking at COVID and going, hey, we hadn't thought about a world where we weren't being able to rely on our neighbors and friends. They did medicine and medical supplies, what are called strategic materials, so like iron, steel, aluminum, the stuff you need for infrastructure, for military defense, like the building blocks of stuff. Computer chips, microchips, both the old style chips are, in our cars and in everything we have, and the faster, newer chips like for AI. A set of energy related stuff. This is where there's a difference. The current administration would probably say nuclear reactors and, equipment to refine oil and gas. For the Democrats, it was solar, wind, and EVs, because a category of transportation equipment. So, for the previous administration, it was trains and mass transit and EVs. Those were the areas that were being specialized in. This administration, it's regular cars and regular trucks, but either way, transportation systems. And then the final one that I think everyone agrees on is communication stuff. So computers, telephonics, satellite, etc. And those are certain things that for sort of infrastructure, communications, health, well-being, those seem to be ones where there's broad agreement. Those are sectors that we need to basically have some self-sufficiency on. I would add, and this is not one, though I bugged the hell out of the Biden people, I would add food processing. Because if we think about how we now are exporting commodities that are at the whim of trade markets and other countries, and farmers are not growing food as much, in part, like in my part of central Wisconsin, that's because the smaller processing plants are gone. So you can sell the stuff, but if you want to actually take a huge lot to market and like have the beans frozen, flash frozen. Like the plant is gone that used to do that. Or you want to have it basically processed in a way so it can go into the school lunch program, for which there's certain safety standards. You need to have the capacity. And so I think we actually need to go and add food processing and distribution. We would have a healthier, more locally rooted food. But like if you look even with NAFTA, in California, you know, the breadbasket of our fruits and vegetables, a lot of the, bird's eye and other of the big plants left and went to Mexico for cheaper labor. And now all the stuff that's grown there gets shipped, the berries, everything gets shipped to Mexico to be processed. Well, that's crazy, to say nothing of all the other places that grow vegetables. In Michigan and Illinois and Wisconsin, all of the bean and potato and other processing, it's just down to a couple, like break bushes there, but like most of them are gone. So I would add that myself.
Anthony, let's go to a couple of hands up. I see Tim and Giles. I'm not sure
I'm
how to
and
pronounce
sorry
his
I'm having to get so close, but I own my reading glasses, and so I'm trying to keep track of what you guys are saying. So excuse my nose being right in your face.
name.
Yeah, this is Tim. Would you like me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Okay, first of all, Lori, thank you. This is a huge, huge, huge topic, complicated. Believe me, and doing it in 1 hour is huge. So thank you. There's a bunch of questions after, but my initial question, at the very beginning, was that Trump sort of kind of like says that tariffs is going to solve our trade deficit problem. Okay. But my mind goes back to when Clinton was around. We had a trade surplus and we had a budget surplus. So my question is how much will tariffs help the big issue of the budget deficit as opposed to everything else that we have to do from a budget standpoint? Or is he just making a false argument that really tariffs is not going to help our budget deficit? Or will it?
Well, do you mean budget deficit or trade deficit?
I mean budget deficit, because he's saying, "Oh, we're gonna make America rich again because we're going to bring all this money because tariffs are going to bring all this money in that's going to increase our budget deficit or improve our budget deficit." And I'm wondering, is it really that big a deal?
So he can't make up for the whole budget deficit, or for that matter, the taxes for the tax cut he wants to give to the billionaires, making the tax cuts permanent. You would have to have a tariff rate of like 60% on everything to make up for that. And he's sort of looking back wistfully to like the turn of the previous century, where he is forgetting that the US budget was much smaller, that didn't have all of the programs that we now have and need and support, and the country was much smaller. And he's sort of thinking of the McKinley administration, where you could use a tariff to largely support a lot of the national budget. So just as a general matter, and I ain't no economist, but just looking at the numbers by economists that I trust, it doesn't add up. You can't just basically tariff our way into a budget balance or a pay off the taxes. That said, part of what I think they're up to with the 10% across the board tariff is to have revenue as part of the offset for the tax cuts, so that they can, basically only 2/3 destroy Medicaid. No, I'm being very sarcastic now, but I think they're going to get some revenue that's part of it. The big question is, can tariffs help with the trade deficit? And the answer is yes, but. So there are very specific ways in which you could use tariffs to try and help with the trade balance. Probably the bigger, more impactful tool that would have less disparate impacts, less harsh impacts on people with less income, and that would hit more the wealthy people who can take it, is if you did capital controls. So basically, if you think about our trade balance, on the one hand, we've got goods that we're importing and we've got dollars going out, and then the dollars come back in. And you can either think about the mercantile countries, you know, boosting exports because that's their thing, export-led growth. But it only works if once they sell the stuff, there's someplace they can put the dollars. So the other way you disincentivize, I mean, if you're not going to get them to stop doing the cheating, which has not worked up until this point, you can try and cut off the market, and you'd have to do it with a bunch of other countries. So if you were going to go the tariff route, you would need to get those countries that are in balance and the 66 other deficit countries together to put up a wall of tariffs against the cheating countries. You'd have to do it that way. Otherwise, you'd have trade displacement like we just did China. Alternatively, if you did capital controls, and you basically said inflows of foreign investment into, and it would be the stock market, luxury real estate, like you would allow it to make new plant and equipment, but you wouldn't allow it into sort of the speculative sectors, you would have much less incentive to want to sell all this stuff here because you can't do anything with your damn money once you have your dollars in your hand. So that's the other way you do it. You basically shut down the US export of dollar-denominated speculative investment opportunities, and probably a combination of the both is what you'd have to do. There is a bill that, if anyone wants to understand what I'm talking about, this capital control idea, it's called a trade balance surcharge. Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat from Wisconsin, and Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, have this bill together that would enact that kind of a capital control to rebalance trade. And that is probably how I would prefer to do it as compared to the tariffs. If only because at this point, tariffs have been so toxified, it's unclear we'd ever get a tariff strategy that other countries would trust us with.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Tim. We're a little bit over the hour. Lori, can you go to 5:15?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So Giles, we're going to take your question next, and then we're going to go back to the chat. Probably the last one question from Giles and one more from the chat. Go ahead, Giles.
Thank you. A great discussion, and I'd love to have another one just dealing with the agricultural issues, but that's not my question. Can you comment on the role of the VAT in the trade imbalance?
I'm sorry, it's gotten so noisy here. Hold on one second. Can I get you to shut that door? The VAT tax, I think, is what you asked. Okay, so just to get everyone up to speed, a VAT, a value-added tax, is a methodology of taxation. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a different way of doing it. And what it does is it basically like, well, we do income tax, so we do corporate taxes. This is a charge on each level of value added to a good, and you pay it along the way. The reason it becomes a trade issue, and I think why you're asking this question, is because most of the countries in the world have value-added taxes. They don't have our taxation system. And when something is exported, the VAT that's been paid along the way gets refunded. And so it's basically acts like a subsidy. So the reason Trump is nuts about the VAT tax, and particularly Europe's VAT tax, which in some places like in Germany, they have like local, regional, and federal VAT taxes. The reason why they get so wound up about it is because it serves like a subsidy. So let's just say it's a 25% tax rate, similar to like our corporate tax rate, but then it's refunded. So those companies get the money back. The product basically has this unfair benefit when it's coming across. And similarly, when we send something to Europe, the VAT is added on. And that's a double whammy because those companies have already paid taxes under the US system, and then the VAT gets added on. So that is why it has a trade effect. Now, the problem is their system isn't wrong and our system isn't wrong. They're different. So we have to figure out a way that doesn't end up having a trade impact. Like in my ideal new trade system, you'd still be able to use subsidies, but you'd have rules about what's actionable and what's not. And so an actionable subsidy would be one you'd be able to countervail against. So another country is allowed to use a subsidy if they want to make sure they can make blah, blah, and that takes a subsidy to get that started up. go at it, go forth and prosper. But if it's going to affect my trade at a certain level, then I get to do something at my border to counter it so it doesn't flatten me. And so in the same way with the VAT tax versus our kind of tax system, go forth and prosper, do it whatever way you want to do it. The question is how you make sure that you're not creating an imbalance or an unfairness between the systems.
Thanks, Lori. Okay, I think this will be our last question for the day. So what is the reaction you're seeing in the ag sector, and is it divided, like big corporate ag, small family farmers? How are they reacting to the tariffs, and what do they want ideally?
It's a mix. So there are some sectors like the cow and calf operations that have been getting flattened, who want to produce meat and have country of origin labels and produce meat for the US. Those guys are thrilled. They see imports coming from a variety of countries that don't meet the same food safety standards because of those WTO rules I was talking about. There's a thing called equivalence, where food that doesn't meet the US standard, but the other country says they have an equivalent system, gets to come in. It's an incredible scam. I spent about 20 years trying to sue in the 90s and early 2000s to get that knocked out. As a result, countries like where we'd only have the FDA or the USDA would only have approved like one packing house could import to the US, export to the US. Now the whole country sends stuff. So those guys are very happy because it basically countervails the difference in what they think is the unfair externalization of health and safety costs and decent salaries, etc. Folks who trade in commodities are in a panic. Basically, they need to have the big trading companies buy their tons of wheat, soy, etc. And that's exactly the first thing that's going to get tariffed as far as a sensitive, like the kick in the shin equivalent in countervailing tariffs is usually ag exports. And it's a fungible good. So you can tariff it on a country you're trying to get at and then buy it from someplace else. So you don't want to tariff the thing where it's like hitting your own self in your own face. Because if you're totally reliant on something only one country makes and you tariff it, all you've done is basically make yourself a problem. So I think a lot of rural folks with whom I've spoken who are actually in the agriculture economy directly are very anxious. And rightly so, because, if you have to service your debt and every year you need to have some amount of revenue coming in to service your debt and to buy the seed and the inputs and pay the mortgage on the harvester and blah, 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 you need to have income coming in, and you don't know what the markets are going to be. You have no idea. So that is a certain cause of anxiety. I would say that, the way the rules are set up, some of the big agribusiness guys aren't as upset because, like the WTO rules, just for like friends who are in the ag economy, I mean, this, but for folks who aren't, the WTO rules forbid supply management. It's like all the systems you might keep a price floor by using supply, ban price floors, ban a bunch of the subsidies on things like, for instance, within caps, set-asides or subsidies for equipment or for like low-till farming methodologies, etc. And they allow unlimited export subsidies. So the commodity traders can use export subsidies and can continue to basically have the governments do that with no implication, and the actual farmers take it in the shorts. So I think the traders are somewhat less worried because they're going to be able to trade between some countries at some volume and get government subsidies. The likelihood is if the full set of tariffs go back into effect, probably the US government will do some kind of a deficiency payment type program like they did the last time around, because there will be countervailing tariffs and there will be markets that get shut.
Well, Lori, thank you very much. Incredibly informative presentation, really pulling so much information and so much complexity together in a very understandable way. A lot of great response from our participants. 2 reminders for folks. One is that Ruby's Community Works monthly orientation is 3 weeks from today. It's at 6:30 Eastern Time on Wednesday, the 25th of June. So for those of you who've heard about and are looking to get involved with Ruby's local engagement initiative, Community Works, please join Meredith Dean, our director, on the 25th at 6:30 p.m. You can sign up at the Ruby website. Second thing is just a tiny bit of good news. Many of you know that we met with Ken Martin, the new DNC chair, back in February. No, excuse me, back in April. Many of you signed the letter we sent to Ken in February. One of the things we asked Ken to do was to, lead the charge to have major donors donate to Democrats, to start focusing some of their donations on rural and working class communities. And just today, we got a confirmation of a date for our first meeting with donors to try to create a pool of investment into local Democratic committees, into local candidates, and into local organizations working in rural and working class communities. So you'll hear more about it, but we have a date, it's going to happen, and that's a bit of a step in the right direction. So again, thanks very much to Lori and to all of our participants this evening. Take care.